I fell in love with Laurie's writing last year and read a couple of her books. And then I read this one, and it was so good that I bought a copy for my mom for Mother's Day last year, and my father-in-law for his birthday last year. And it is rare that I would buy 3 copies of a book. So I loved this book so much. And I'm not really a historical fiction like big fan. That's not my favorite genre. So the fact that it's historical fiction and I loved it that much, I knew that this had to be the first one that we did for this book group. So I am going
Thank
to
you.
stop sharing my screen, and then there's a way to put this so that there we go. So Laurie, welcome. And
Welcome. Thank you.
yes, let me just give you guys the official bio of Laurie. Laurie, also known as L.C. Lewis for her historical fiction, grew up within the exciting and history-rich corridor between Philadelphia, Baltimore, and D.C., which made her a politics and history junkie. Laurie writes in multiple genres, penning her women's fiction and romance novels as Laurie Lewis and her historical fiction novels as L.C. Lewis. And using this pen name, she wrote this World War II drama based on the life of a survivor of the occupation of France called The Letter Carrier. It was published in 2022, and it went on to win 2 2023 Whitney Awards, and one was for the novel of the year and one for best historical fiction. And then it was also awarded the 2023 Reader's Favorite Gold Medal for Inspirational Fiction. She currently has 16 published books, so if you love this one, go grab another one. Her 17th is in beta readers, and her 18th she is writing, so there's even more books to come. So that is a little bit about Laurie. So welcome, Laurie. We're glad you're here.
Thank you so much. I am just worried. Can you see okay with this sun? Shall I close this curtain? Because we're on vacation. I'm in California right now. My family is at the pool, and I've got a couple people in here watching cartoons or something. So is this too bright, or is that okay?
Oh, I think it looks just fine. Yeah, I was just going to tell everybody that you were kind enough to come to us on vacation and take a little break from your family vacation to join us today.
No,
So,
I'm excited to be here.
yeah, why don't you just start by kind of telling us the background of how this story came to be?
Okay. Well, in 2016, I went into this assisted living center where my mom was staying. My mom had dementia, and I had just published a book called The Dragons of Alsace Farm, which was about a woman who had survived the bombing of the Alsace region of France as a child, and who now lived on a farm, and she had dementia. It was loosely based on my mom's life, but I didn't want it to parallel her too much. So I made this woman a French survivor of the war. So I had done some research on France and World War II. And when I got to the nursing home, there was this tiny little woman sitting next to my mom, and they were both just smiling, and I could tell that they had become fast friends. And as soon I could estimate her age because I'm of my mom's age, and as soon as I heard her French voice, I knew that she had survived something extraordinary during World War II. And I said, "You are a living Agnes." And she didn't know what I meant by that. And I said, "I bet you have a story to tell." And she said, "I've tried to tell it many times, but it's just too hard." And and then we talked a little bit, and I told her, I said, "Well, she started telling me a little bit, and I just was amazed by it." And I said, "Well, I will help you write your story." And I thought we were going to just be writing a story for her family to share. And the more we talked and the things she told me, they were so amazing. And it just became so clear to me that this wasn't a book just for her family. This was a book that another generation needed to read and understand. So I found out actually, and I have some little things for you. So the Michelle that I met that day, this is my Michelle. This is Michelle Nage. This is me with her daughter Beatrice. And the reason we're holding up chocolate is because a lot of times, as we did Q&As, I would come with questions, and delving into her past was so painful. Michelle would just fall apart. But she wanted her story told, and so we would eat chocolate and we would sing whatever little French song I remember from high school French. And then anyway, this is her beautiful face. This is Michelle Nage.
So sweet.
And as she was telling me her story, I came to find out that Michelle had once been a very popular speaker at colleges and high schools in the Washington, D.C. region. And then one day, the invitations to speak just went away. And she was very worried about that. It was like it was not polite, or it was not socially comfortable to talk about World War II anymore. And that made her nervous because she remembered how quickly France just fell. And she ascribed to the theory that if we do not learn from the past, we are destined to repeat it. And that was a very big worry to her. So she had told her story, but she'd only written it about 30 pages of it. And it was primarily the section of her life leading up to the evacuation out of France. And at that point, what happened was so hard for her to talk about. She just put the manuscript away. So I got her daughter, Beatrice, who I showed you. I got her to agree to let me interview her mom. And we started a series of interviews for 3 years. I interviewed her once a month for 3 years. I would go and visit her. She was moved down to West Virginia, so it was a pretty good drive.
Mm.
And then we would talk about it. And then little by little, the story came out. And it took 8 years. Various conflicts, including COVID, got in the way. But it took us 8 years to actually, to get to here. I mean, it was 6 years to get the manuscript written. And then it was just a really hard time getting it marketed and getting people to even know about it. So that's kind of our nutshell on our saga.
So interesting. It sounds like you have some French background then on your mother's side.
A little tiny bit. Mostly it was just that I don't, it's so interesting that I made my mom a French survivor, because she's actually Portuguese, but her father had a little French. But I was so intrigued by the story that I was learning about French Jews and how their art was being stolen. And so I started writing about that back like in 2012. I think that book came out around 2015 or 16. But I just put that in because I didn't want to tell my mom's story so clearly that everyone would know, because the woman in the story was quite affected by dementia.
Hmm.
And I knew my family was just accepting that that was my mom's story. So I just kind of I tailored the person. Agnes in the book is like my mom, but yeah, mostly we're a Portuguese bunch on my mom's side.
So I was telling somebody about the book and about your process, and they said, well, why didn't you just write a biography? Why make it historical fiction? So can you speak to that?
Oh, I can. Well, I would have loved to have done a straight biography. But it would have been a completely different story. But we had a couple of problems. Number one, Michelle was in her mid to late 80s, and she had beginnings of dementia. And so she would tell me things, but I wasn't confident that what she was telling me was actually accurate. So then I have to go do a lot of research to verify, and some of it I couldn't verify. The other thing is, she would tell me a story and she would say, I was riding my bike and I saw the Nazis come and take a boy and lead him into the woods and shoot him. And I said, do you remember his name? She didn't remember his name. She didn't remember where it happened. She didn't remember how old she was. So Beatrice provided me with a collegiate study that was done on that area after the war. And when we went through that collegiate study, there was a mention of a young boy who had been pulled out of his workshop and drug into the woods and just killed and left there. His parents weren't even notified that it had happened. And and so I wondered, is this the boy? And his name matched a name of a friend of her brother's. We assumed this was the boy. So because we couldn't verify every single fact, we can verify the most of the experiences, but we can't verify the details. So
Right.
that's why we have to call it historical fiction. And then I wasn't with her when she was a young girl in that school. And there's a school scene that's kind of chilling. And she could never talk about it very far. She would take me to a certain point in the story many times. As soon as we get to that point, she would fall apart. And her daughter would look at me and she just kind of like shake her head and let's not go any farther there. And so what I wrote, what Michelle told me about the experience, but I feel certain the experience was far worse than what I wrote. So I don't take the reader into terrible dark places. I lead them to a place that the reader then can interpret what may or may not have happened, because I wanted to respect Michelle, her dignity. I want to respect her family's peace, at the
Yeah.
end. So that's why we didn't do a full historical. We did historical fiction.
Hmm. I feel like there is a richness, though, that you brought to that with it being fiction in the way you write fiction versus the way you write biography that really draws the reader in a different way. So I'm glad you did it that way.
Thank you. I'll tell you, the time I spent with her, getting to know her spirit as well as her life. She wanted to be a nun. She didn't become a nun. She believed that her mother had lived as noble a life as a mother and a wife as a person could ever live, and so she considered that to be a noble calling, and so she aimed her life in that direction. But and as a child, as a young woman, she always thought she would be a nun, and so as I met with her and got to know her spirit. Now, I'm not Catholic, so but I can interpret. I understood. We spoke spirit to spirit. Even her daughter, who's a totally different religion. She's not Catholic and she's not of my faith. It's a different religion, but we all became. She was very cute. She goes, "We are sisters in Christ," and I thought, exactly, that's what we are. We are sisters in Christ. And I felt like I knew Michelle's heart. So I wrote what I believed Michelle how she would have responded, because she couldn't tell me
Yeah,
anymore. It was just too much.
yeah,
So anyway, I'm glad it was touching. I appreciate that. Thank you.
yeah. So besides 3 years of interviewing Michelle, that, most people wouldn't see that through, but what other research went into this book? Because I know you did a lot beyond just talking with Michelle and her family.
Yeah, there was quite a bit. Um, the most probably harrowing part of my research came from she kept telling me that she had met General Patton, and I was trying so hard to find a place where General Patton and she would have made contact. So, in order to find out his movements, I read his personal diary, which is available online. Anybody can read it.
Wow.
And a couple of things came from that. First of all, I did find a place where she so there was a she went a town was the village in France where I'm looking for my information, was the village in France where Michelle would go to be the letter carrier, or
Hmm.
she was what they called back then the telephone telegraph. It'll come to me. Anyway, they had a little band and they would be in charge of rations, mail, and prescriptions, medicines. So that was what Michelle ended up doing. And when she would go to run her route, she would go to a tent. Well, in a tent, there was a base there, military base. General Patton never served there or never commanded there. He was commanding over everything with the Third Army, but he did come here to hold meetings,
Okay.
and in the place called the Le Marie, which is the town hall in a tent. So Michelle saw a gathering here. Eisenhower came here, a bunch of big military. I can't remember who all came, but there was a Eisenhower and Patton and a few others came to this area for a bunch of big important meetings, and mostly to make those little black and white films, you'd see in World War
Yeah.
II, those shorts to keep the spirits up of the people back home and of the soldiers. So, but they had the town hall was Le Marie, and upstairs there was a meeting, and Michelle, I cannot verify this, but what she described and the fact that he was there makes me think that's where she met him.
Yeah.
So but I had to find out that he was actually in a place where she could meet him. And there's a fun story about a couple of GIs who were dads who had kids at home that were roughly her age, and they had come to love her and her family, and they kind of they set her up, and their stories in the book are great. They're just a wonderful view of the American GI. But the other thing that struck me about reading General Patton's diary was the casualty numbers of the American dead. I mean, just amazing numbers that would just, I would read them and I would just like, I couldn't breathe. They were so horrible. And then the impact when Michelle understood, she's only 16, when she comes to understand the number of lives being lost to protect the people that are basically strangers in a land that is not these soldiers' own homeland, it does create a sense of debt and incredible gratitude, but also debt. But there are also so many fun times, and I wanted to capture that too because we needed a little joy in this book.
Yeah, for sure.
So this was Michelle when the Allies arrived, roughly when the Allies arrived. And then this is a sketch, an American GI, and it's hard to read down here, but he was from the tank destroyer unit. I'm trying to find this soldier who did this or his family, but he
Uh-huh.
did a sketch of Michelle, and then another soldier carved this little wooden box for her to keep her letters in.
Oh,
So these are all treasures that her daughter now uh, has held on to. So that was a lot of the research. The other research was I knew Michelle lived in a farming area, so I could tell a lot about what it was like to live under Nazi occupation if you were in a farm area. But I needed to know what it was like for people outside that area, which was a different circumstance. There was starvation, malnutrition. There was parents were doing terrible things to probably to they just thought it was better to they didn't want their children to suffer anymore, and so a lot of horrible things were happening. And I wanted people to get a glimpse of not just what was going on in Brocky, but what her brother was seeing, what her friend um um oh, my brain has gone
Leger.
really bad. Yes, Leger. What Leger was seeing, and they were coming, how that was impacting their response to Michelle when she was, struggling with the war and stuff. She was getting these other points of view. So anyway, and I just wanted it to be as accurate as possible. So we pulled from newspaper articles, we pulled from journals, and just it was a slow process, which is one of the reasons why the book took so long to write.
Yeah, absolutely. That was extremely thorough and impressive. Um, I thought maybe we could, does anybody have any questions for Laurie specifically so far? Either can put it in the chat or just unmute yourself if you have a specific question.
have one question. You
Okay.
mentioned that it takes it, or this book took like 8 years total to work
Yes.
on. So when you're, because there's a lot of research involved, are you working on another book too, or is each book you take or each book you write take that long?
No, I'm in different phases with different books. And I need to back up because it was really 6 years. We are at 8 years now. I met her in 2016, so it was about 6 years. But yeah, so this was really hard because in order to tell her story, because it was the lives of her uncles were also involved, her mom's brothers. We had to get legal releases from all of these families to tell their story. And that was a grueling process. And Beatrice took the lead on all that. We had to send copies of the book to everybody, and they had to read it, and then they had to sign a legal release. All of those kinds of things put large stalls in the process of this book. Also, once the pandemic hit, I could not visit Michelle anymore. All the nursing homes were knocked down or were locked down. And then, and when I called her, she didn't know who I was anymore. So everything I did at that point was with emails with Beatrice. So that was very tight, time consuming. So while I was waiting for answers to come, I was working on the next couple of books, that were coming out. So I generally I work on two at a time. One, I'm in the middle of editing, or beta readers have it, or I'm working on the covers or working on the marketing plan, and then I'm writing another one. So yeah, it's a multiple project process, and I like to try to do two different book types so I don't get them mixed up. And so right now I'm doing a romantic series. It's called Silver Buckle Brides, and it's based on this family that owns this silver mine, and the books are the same genre, and so it's really hard for me to keep the characters sorted out. So it's actually easier when I'm doing like historical fiction and a romance to keep them kind of sorted out. So that's what I would recommend.
I love it. I love it.
And are all of your books self-published? I read at the end you said that you had a hard time getting a regular publishing company. I'm sorry, I don't know much about the process, but a regular publishing company. So you said you had to do it self-published. So
Yeah.
was it just because of the theme, or is that like the norm? Have you found that with your other books also? I was wondering if the bigger ones didn't want to touch it because of the topic or something. I was curious.
Oh no. Okay. So I started with a publishing company called Covenant, and they took my first book, and I did my first three books with them. And then this I was working on a historical fiction series that was based on the War of 1812, and they did this, it's a business, and they didn't feel like the sales were where they wanted that series to go. So they wanted me to change and move over and start doing a Civil War series. But I had already written book three in the series, and my readers wanted book three. So I said, I really just need to finish this. And so we parted ways for a while, and then I worked with another publisher. So, I mean, I've done a little bit of both. If you publish some self-published and some with a traditional publisher, you're called a hybrid. And that's kind of what I was, or what I kind of am. But in this particular case, the publisher that I was working with did offer me a book deal, but it was just an ebook, which I needed this to be a paperback. I just felt like this was a book families needed to be able to put on their shelves, and I wanted to imagine moms and dads and their children reading this book together, which I don't see that as easily with ebooks. So I wanted this to be a paperback, and they couldn't tell me at the time, but they all at that moment, because the releases hadn't happened, they were already doing several World War II novels that were already in their publishing queue. So when I come in and say, listen, I need this book and I got to get it done fast because Michelle is not doing well and I want to get this book in her hands, and they're saying, that time frame isn't going to work for us, but we'll do the ebook. And I said, no, then I'll just do it myself, and that's kind of what happened. And publishing with a traditional publisher is time consuming too, because most publishers, you have to have an agent first. So first you have to sell yourself to the agent, unless you're already under contract with an agent. And then they have to shop that book to a publisher, and then a publisher is going to stick it in the queue, which could be 2 years, 3 years, unless it's something so tied to current events that they push it ahead of other projects because it's urgent right now. We've got to get this book out right now. So that's why I just did it. It was really a time thing. I needed it to go out. I wanted so much for Michelle to hold this book in her hand before she died. And as it turned out, we were able to put a manuscript and let her see the cover before she died, but she never actually held the finished book. So anyway, that's why that story turned out the way it did. But
Thank you.
and
Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you are so welcome. It's been good and it's been bad, because the reach of the book is just is a fraction of what we were hoping it would be, because marketing is very hard. There's so many books vying for the attention of readers, and so we were glad to hear that some schools are starting to put it in their schools. That was very exciting to hear. But for the most part, it was all about Michelle and her family. And I don't know if you've heard the end story about her family, but at the end, I'll tell you what happened to her family when we get finished.
Okay.
It's kind of cool. It's the best part.
One last question is, if you had gone with a traditional publishing company, is it true, like I said, I don't know anything about publishing, I'm just like what I've read and stuff. Is it true that they might have like swayed you to change certain parts in the book that you, or the title or whatever, you have the story set in your mind because you really want it to be about Michelle. You really want it to be about her experience. And yes, it's historical fiction, but is it true that they might have said, no, take that chapter out. We don't like that. Or why don't you change this? Do they do this so then it's not really what you want? Is that true with traditional publishers?
Well, luckily the publishers I've worked with don't try to change my voice, and they, for the most part, they will make suggestions. There are some things that they feel like if that's going to be a legal issue for them, they will say, okay, we will publish this book, except we've got to do A, B, and C, For this book, that was the scariest part of self-publishing this book, because I was so worried. I thought if we missed one person we needed to get a legal release from and we didn't get it, and they found the book uncomfortable, we were going to be in so much trouble. And Beatrice took care of that. She got hold of all her cousins and she said, I need something from each of you. And they were so positive about the book that, they took my fear away. But those are the kinds of things that a publisher can say, I don't like this topic, or this topic is not socially acceptable. We're going to get backlash. I have not had that experience with my publishers. They've been pretty great about all that. But when you self-publish, you have complete control and you also have complete liability. So it is a two-edged sword.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about getting approval from the extended family, and now some of those are still in France, correct?
Yes, everybody's in France except her daughter and her son.
So are they bilingual? Were they able to read the English version, or were you having to translate things, or how did that work?
For the most part, they all are French speakers primarily. They might have some English, but nobody was, to my knowledge, none of them are like able to pick up an English book and just read it. So that was part of the tedium of the process, because they would have to find someone to either translate it or read it. And then once they heard the story, then they signed off. But from the time releases were requested till we got the signed releases, it was probably 8 months till we got the last one. It was a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big process.
And scary, because you think, oh, I've spent all these years on this book and I might not be able to publish this book. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, jump in.
So did any of the extended family have additional information that was helpful, or maybe a different point of view or anything?
Hey, that's a great question. And if it's okay, Deb, I'm just going to tell the great part of the story right now. Is that okay?
Yeah, jump in.
Is that okay? So, this is what Michelle, right before she died, this is the last photo I have of Michelle. She was getting really sick, and her daughter had been to France. I think it was like 16 years ago was the last time she had been to France to visit her cousins, because that was the last time Michelle was well enough to go. And there had very little communication in between. A few Christmas cards, a wedding invitation, wedding announcement, something like that, but not a lot of regular communication. So when Beatrice sent those out, we had no idea what we were going to get. And what we found out was, I would have loved to have gotten any further information, but what we found out was really even more stark. So Michelle had told her children a little bit, mostly what they learned about their mother's experience in the war was that she learned to be very handy, crafty, frugal, those hardworking. That's what they knew. They knew a little bit about that the Nazis were there, but Michelle didn't talk a lot about it. Her brothers, the other 5 children, were all brothers. They never spoke of the war to their children. So when the children got the manuscript and read their family stories, the comment that came back to me through Beatrice was, for the first time, now I know my father. So, and I don't know why the brothers didn't, if it was such a humiliating experience, because really, when you read the book, Deb read it twice. So I imagine the second time she probably tuned in more to maybe the parts that aren't written in the book, like what it was like to be a woman in a home alone with Nazi soldiers who have control over life and death, and what it would be like for the men who have to leave every day knowing you're leaving your women at home alone in the company of these Nazi soldiers. And so I don't know if that experience just made them it was so painful or so humiliating or just so traumatizing, but they blocked it out or didn't talk about it. And once the children read it, I feel like their dads would have loved to have seen or heard their children's response, because they were so proud of them. They thought they were amazing and brave, and that they were good and kind and noble. And I just think, I'm sure they're hearing those words in heaven, but I wish they could have heard them, and maybe it would have taken some of the sting of their experience away. But the children just thought, I had this amazing family. And I feel like they and all of them except Beatrice, because Beatrice has some health concerns of her own, they all went back to the home where they lived, where the occupation occurred. So they all went back there together, and they just felt like, we need to go back. We need to see where they were when they did all this. So I was really gratified. And now they're talking to each other, and they think they have an amazing family. So the story that we started out making a family story and then turned it into a generational story for the public, it went back to being a family story ultimately.
That's so great. And I was thinking as you told about that, so often we hear about soldiers who come back from war and never tell their families about the horrors that they saw. And so I wonder if that was just the same situation with them. Like, it was so horrific that they didn't want to go there in their own mind, and they didn't want to pass that down to their families and let them know about it. Because yeah, we live in such a privileged time that we just don't have any idea. And when we talked on the phone the other day, you were mentioning that stuff like this is going on in our world today, And
Yeah.
we're living in this wonderful, free, protected society here in America, and we just don't realize the horrors that other people have to live with every day. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it was so good to hear that it was helping kids who didn't understand their dads. Maybe they found them to be cold or difficult to reach, and now they're like, amazing. I thought, oh, I would have loved to see the dad's expressions if they could hear that, you know.
yeah.
So
So,
anyway, it encourages me to say to other people, interview your grandparents, interview your
yeah,
parents, get the stories down. Maybe they won't talk about it, but if you ask the right questions, they will talk a little bit. So
yeah. So by the time this story came out, Michelle's brothers had all passed away already.
there were two that were gone and two had dementia.
Okay.
Yeah. So they were not of sound mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, to really understand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would
I'm
love
sorry.
to talk a little bit about some of the scenes in the story that are true. We touched on a couple of them, like General Patton, and then just that horrible scene in the school and some of the things that schoolmaster did. But one of the most amazing miracles in that story was when Jacques got shot. And this is a true story, right? This isn't your fictionalized version.
Yeah. No, I had no idea that this was a real thing. And Michelle was telling me that he got shot in the heart. And I said, Michelle, how could he survive getting shot in the heart? And she said, because when the heart, because when the heart beats, it contracts. And it went right at the second. And I just thought, yeah, that is truly a miracle. That's a miracle. There's so many miracles in the book, though. So I just thought, of course it was a miracle. Of course that happened because this family was supposed to survive, you know.
Clearly, yeah, there were so many miracles to, yeah. And when you see what was happening to the people in their community, the fact that they all came through it alive is truly a miracle. Another one of my favorite, most heartwarming parts of the book is the red parachute dress. Tell us
Yes.
a little bit
Yes.
about Michelle's perspective on that.
Okay, well, she talked about this red dress, and I kept envisioning this beautiful silk ball gown, you know. But then knowing Michelle, I should have known that is not the dress she would ever make. But these soldiers wanted her to go to this dance, and she just, you know, she didn't feel like it was a time to dance, and they wanted her to, you know, like the cost of freeing her people was so high. They wanted her to make their life big, you know, like do something great with your life, be happy, be joyful, you know, with your life. And so these two soldiers, LeBlanc and oh gosh, this is I should have reread this recently. Le, anyway, one is LeBlanc, which means he talks a lot. He talks. And then the other one is they named him the corkscrew because he drinks too much.
Yeah,
And so yeah, Torbichon. And so they were kind of in charge of supplies. And there were red parachutes that were used for night drops because the red would kind of get lost in the sky where a white one would be more noticeable. So they were more rare, but they did some finagling and they got this red parachute and they gave it to her. And where I was expecting her to make this beautiful Cinderella type of ball gown, she made a very modest red dress. It had a little collar. The neckline was modest, had little puffy sleeves on it. It was very form fitting with the one extravagance that she gave herself was a very full skirt so that when she twirled, it went out.
oh, so fun.
Yeah. And then, but the fabric was so rare. And really, by this time in the war, most people were patching their clothes together. You know, like everybody looked ragged and everything was patched and repaired. And So for her to have the extravagance of this beautiful dress was almost obscene for her, but she did make this dress. And then she also made a few other things with the fabric, for her family. Um, I asked her if she still had it, and she said when she got married, she married an American GI, and they were transferred to Germany first, which was very hard for her.
I bet.
And yeah, and then from Germany they came to Louisiana, and she just said she doesn't know what happened to it. It got lost in all the travels. But there really was a parachute dress. And if you Google dresses made from parachutes, you'll notice that that was quite common in World War II.
Oh, interesting.
So soldiers brought their parachutes back because they were, first of all, great fabric, either silk or nylon, both of which were very good fabrics. And because they felt like their parachutes had saved their lives, it had meaning for them, and they would give them to their fiancés to make their wedding gowns. So I'm not saying it was done all the time, but there are quite a few stories about women getting married in their husband's parachute.
That is fascinating. That's so cool. Did anybody else have a favorite scene or part of the story that you'd like Laurie to address? Do, 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 do.
Can you tell us a little bit more about her life after the war, about her husband and
Yes. Okay. Well, in the back of the book, her daughter and her son both write kind of a summary of her life post war, and actually after she came to the United States. So she married an American GI. Her husband that she married. So at the end of the book, the American GI is characterized based on the man she actually married, but I could not use his name. The children did not, was specifically the daughter did not want me to mention her father in the book. But he was a great hero. He had Purple Hearts. He'd gone into the worst places. He had done amazing things because he spoke French out of Louisiana. It was kind of a Creole version, but he spoke French, and he was there for one of the first ones to go into the worst situations. And he would be like an interpreter. Today they call them interpreters. Back then it was like you were an interrogator. So he received quite a lot of injuries, but he came out of it so broken. And as a result of that, he was not able to be a good husband or a good father. So it was just so sad because he had given everything to these principles, and then it had ruined his own personal life, and it left Michelle penniless with 2 children. So she was raising children, and she relied on those skills she learned. She knew deprivation. She knew how to stretch a penny to grow a garden. So she mostly raised her children she painted little paintings and sold them, and she babysat other children. She cut her own hair. She made her own clothes. She did everything, to make a penny go as far as it could. But the children, they both revere their mother. They loved her very much. I hope somewhere in the heavens there'll be a chance for them to talk to their dad, because he left when they were very tiny. He was just gone. And it was really sad. So Michelle, he moved her back to the Washington area before he left. So she ended up in the DC area, which is why she was there to talk at schools and, to do all those other things. The kids, her son lives in California, and he has a lot of friends that are German, and he was very concerned that writing this book would characterize all the German people as bad. But, we wanted to make sure that we showed both sides. They were as under the thumb of the Nazi regime as the other Europeans were. And also that Michelle went there, and it was a very cathartic experience for her to meet the German people and to know that they had also suffered, and they didn't individually hate her any more than she hated them originally. It was just that the circumstances had made them enemies. But she, she got through that, and her daughter embraced the German culture, and it was just like this whole thing came full circle. Her daughter met her husband doing German dancing at a folk dancing
Wow.
festival or something. So
Wow.
yeah, so yeah, so things came full circle for them, but they were very impressed with she was like the best person they ever knew. Like in terms of a good, like a Christ-like woman, she was the best example they could imagine of that kind of person. And she, she just I learned so much from her. She had experienced really hard things, but she was not an angry person or a vindictive person. She was just a gentle person. I think so much gratitude filled her heart all the time that her number one thing was to please God. That was her most important thing. And then, but she was very adamant that freedom is very fragile. It is lost in a blink if we are not vigilant, and the cost to get it back is unfathomable in both treasure and life. And she just felt like if we are casual in our worldview and in our protection of our liberties, that she didn't want this to happen to anybody else. And so in the book, I in the opening of the book, which I love that opening scene because I kind of had to make that up based on what I knew about Michelle, because by the time I decided to put that chapter in, she could not communicate anymore. But I knew that she had gone to schools, and I knew how fervently she feared that she did not want anyone else to have the experience she had. So we just we make up this scene where she's at this school the last time she's getting invited to speak. And it's kind of based on this newspaper article that I showed you a picture of. And I forget what paper that was. Let me see. It was a pretty big paper. But anyway, so I based it on this story. But she just says, "My name is Michelle Nage. I've come here to tell you a story, my story, a story I tell you because I never want it to become your story." And that's basically how she felt. She just wanted people not to repeat her experience. And she watched France fall. It happened so fast,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I think that's profound. Well, before we end here, I wanted to think about what are the lessons. Oh, Krista has a question.
I did have a question if there's still is there still time?
Oh yeah, we got time.
Okay, so this might sound a little glib after dealing with such like heavy-weighted themes as freedom and everything, but I loved how you approached Michelle's height in the book. Especially in the opening chapter, how she's using it to endear herself to the crowd. I mean, I'm kind of tall, so sometimes people don't like that I'm tall, and I figure it's the same thing for short people sometimes. So I really did love that, and it was interesting how it protected her in a way that she could seem younger than she was. I just wonder if there's anything you want to add to that.
Well, she is so tiny. I mean, I don't think she weighed 80 pounds when I met her. She was so tiny. She'd also suffered malnutrition in the ward. So her stature was small. There was not any extra weight on her, but she was, but she had opinions, and she had convictions. They were strong. But I loved it, and that she wanted to be the bell ringer. I love that part too. That she went, and they were like, you barely weigh more than a chicken," "Oh, I'll show you that I can ring that bell." Yeah, and I just love that about her. I love that. And then, her daughter and her son are big people. So her husband, I assume, was a big man. So I can only imagine this tiny little woman with these big children, like You listen to your mother, you know. But that was just but it served her well when she needed to be invisible because she was so small
Yeah.
and people didn't they disregarded her as almost like nothing. And she could like she just kind of moved silently around and they would just almost ignore her sometimes. And then it came in handy when she had to be the letter carrier because, you know, she just could slip through and people didn't notice. She wasn't a beautiful, developed woman to them. She was just this little sprig, you know. And so it came in handy. But she more than made up for it in spirit. She had a great spirit.
I love that.
And
I don't know if I have any more pictures.
uh,
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Deb asked us to kind of if there were any scenes that stood out to us, and I guess what food played a big part in the book. Understandably, like the lack of food and the desperation to find food at certain times and to can it. And I grew up on a farm, and 6 generations in my family are farmers, so I can kind of insert myself in Michelle's place if that were to happen. And I just what they were eating, I found very interesting, and all the canning and then having to prepare all this extra food for the Germans. It's like I can't
Yeah.
imagine how busy they were. Like I have a huge vegetable garden too, and I know how much work that is. Like to be able
Yeah.
to and I mean, there's no way we could survive on what I consider a fairly big vegetable garden through it. So just if you could expand upon any research you did on that, and I find that part very interesting.
Well, she was a big help to me. That was one area where her memory was like she could be kind of lost, but you start talking about the food and she was right there with you, you know. And from the time the children are walking, everybody is working, you know, like even if you're 2 or 3, you can go feed a chicken, you know, you can take the little wisp of straw and you can put bedding down. I mean, everybody is working. Even they get up, they work, then they eat, then they work, then they go to school. So work is, you know, was always survival, even, you know, even before the war, but they had plenty. And I think the thing that was so hard was they had done everything they could do to prepare, always to do all they could to also be able to help their neighbors. And then to watch people come in and just the work you've worked so hard, they just take it and throw it or waste it or have this entitlement to have whatever you've labored for, and then they leave you the scraps, if scraps, you know. And so often I mean, I asked her one time, I said, Michelle, can you think of do you have any memories of when they were good or kind? And she says, no, I don't. So I imagine what that meant was that there were times when they just didn't bother them. Some of them probably didn't bother them, but there weren't any memories she had where they went to any effort to really help. It was a take attitude, but she also had leadership. It wasn't like the average soldier. She had the leadership and she had the SS in her home, and they ruled by might and power and intimidation, you know. So that was hard for her. But I think what she found was those hours when they were working were the most normal hours of her life. When they were in the garden, then the soldiers didn't bother them. Soldiers didn't bother them when they were in the stream getting dinner. Soldiers, they wanted to eat too, so they left them alone. And I think that kitchen became like almost sacred ground. You know, it was where they bottled those little peas in every single wine bottle, you know, but I think that became sacred ground for them. It was a place where they were normal for a little while, you know.
Could you shed some light on them fleeing from their home and then returning to their home? That's a little confusing. Don't know the history.
Okay. So her parents were very prominent in the community because her father was like a machinist. He could fix everything.
Right.
And her mother had these nursing skills. So before they got their own family out, they made sure everybody else's wagons were fixed, their harnesses were fixed. You know, they shared their food with everybody. By the time they got out, the Germans had not only cut the French army off and sent the French army in a retreat, but they had come in on the sides. So as they were retreating south, they made it to this castle where they spent the night, but the Germans had arrived and they sent everyone back because it was a farming community. And the purpose they wanted for this area was to produce food. So they let those people stay there because they needed them to produce food. And it didn't stay there. It went to feed troops. You know, it didn't feed the German people either, they don't think. They think it all went to support their military might. But it was, so that's one of the reasons, that's the miracle that let them stay together. As long as they were useful and they were producing food, keeping the tractors running, then the family was allowed to stay intact. And that's why they had to appear necessary and needful. And they did. They worked hard to stay necessary and needful. Does that help at all?
Sure does. It was the
Okay.
Germans that sent them back. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And I love
yeah.
the doll story.
Oh,
Yeah.
she loved the doll. The doll was, yeah. It was, and she was having a hard time. She was young enough to not understand these dirty people in her garden and, you know, begging it. She didn't understand. And then a couple of days later, she's one of those people. I mean, the emotional switch was very hard, you know.
Mhm.
So, but things happen so fast, you know, just so fast. And I that was the thing that that was the message she wanted to get out. Like, everything might be great today, but how, like the pandemic, how fast everything changed, you know, how quickly the rules changed, the world changed. So my daughter was moving to Utah because her husband got a job in a hospital there, and we lived in Maryland. And I went to visit my mom, and I paid a visit to Michelle. They were in two different places at that point. And then I jumped in a car and drove with my daughter across the country. And on the day we left Maryland, they were talking about they were closing the schools. And it took us 3 days to get to Utah. And I said, I got to get home as fast as possible because I don't know if the planes are going to stop, you know? So I got home. I was never able to see my mother again. I never was able to see her again in this life because she died of COVID in a nursing home. So things happen so fast. And we do have some sense of that. But we luckily were blessed to get back to normal more or less. But, you know, she was making it very clear the fight to normal is really hard in lots of circumstances. So
That's a really good point. Things can change quickly. I wanted to end this by thinking about what are the lessons that we learn from Michelle, just life lessons, but also maybe faith lessons. And I'd love if anybody on the call has a lesson that they learned or gained from the book. If you would like to share that, either unmute or type it in the chat.
I don't know for me if it was a lesson per se, but an affirmation, I guess you could say, of that. With all that pressure to conform to the Germans' will, I'm gonna cry, sorry. Her focus on pleasing God over pleasing the Germans first. I love that.
Yeah,
thank you.
I love that too. Anybody else? I also had this thought over and over again about how people in the same situation did not come out of it being a gentle, noble human being. And we all have stuff in our lives that we have to deal with, and you can choose to be bitter or you can choose to be better. And clearly they chose to seek the good and make their lives better, and to choose forgiveness of people who were horrible and probably didn't deserve forgiveness. Those were a couple of big takeaways for me. And then I just love the theme of we do what we must do. You know, that rang clear through there. And we all have situations in our lives that are hard, and sometimes you do what you must do. Anybody else have a life lesson? And I'm putting in the chat right now different ways that you can connect with Laurie further. If you want to find more of her books or get on her newsletter, follow her on social media. Any other lessons or insights that you gained from the book? How about you, Laurie? You've told us a lot of them, but do you have any other? What is your big takeaway from Michelle?
My big takeaway is the same as and I'm so sorry, I've already forgotten your name.
Krista.
Krista's was that she just believed that if we just do what's right with God, we will be okay. Whatever man can do to us, all we need to do is be focused on doing what's right with God. And that's how she lived her life. You know, that's how she lived her life. And it wasn't an easy life. I think that's the other thing, you know, just because we're good, you try to be good and do the right thing does not guarantee us an easy path, because Michelle and her mom made great sacrifices, and her whole family made great sacrifices to do the most good they could do under their circumstances. But their circumstances were hard, but they did get incredible blessings that they were spared. Their whole family was spared, but the road was not easy. And so sometimes I think when we have difficult times, when life is hard, sometimes it feels, you know, like we're running and we, you know, things aren't getting better. He is there, you know, and that was something I draw back from Michelle. Like, she knew she would look for him and she would find him. And that's, I think, another thing, just to look for him and we will find him. It's not going to be an ease and comfort all the time, but he is there with us by our side. And that, you know, that was my big takeaway from Michelle. So
I love that.
thank you all for your comments and questions. I really appreciate it. I wish my mind were more clear on names today. They were very good today. Sorry.
No, we appreciate you so much coming and sharing the behind the scenes view of this book, and especially taking time out of your vacation to be here. I just appreciate it greatly.